They're salivating. Didgeridoo 3 in the chat. Good to see you as always. I'll give us a thumbs up if we sound good. Aaron went to. Oh, there's the. I just got a couple echoes going on. Great. That means we're live.
All right.
Awesome. And Aaron's with us today, guys. We're live. Aaron just went live. We went to go grab a book. I'm excited for this talk. Definitely something that Bear and I love is the Essenes and Jesus. So we're going to have a fun one today. I'm going to go ahead and hit record and we'll fire this bad boy up. Good to be with you today, Aaron. Stoked to finally connect.
Likewise, man. It's going to be a fun conversation today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. One of my favorite subject matters.
Oh,
and
goody.
Can compare notes here.
Yeah, I've been Jesus, I think 3 or 4 times for Halloween. Is that bad?
Oh, really? I'm pretty sure you go to hell for that, actually.
Yeah, I thought so.
If you believe in Paul's version of Jesus, you definitely go to hell. If you believe in Jesus's version of God, you'll be forgiven.
I went as hippie Jesus. So I went as like American 1970s Jesus and a peace, peace symbol on. And
white, blonde, hippie Jesus.
Yeah, white, blonde, hippie Jesus with a joint in my ear.
That's a good costume.
I'm a recovering Catholic. I grew up in a Latin Catholic, 12 years of parochial school background. So I was convinced in the 6th grade I was going to go to hell for eating meat on Friday and didn't confess it, which is a mortal sin, and receive communion on top of that, which is sacrilege. So I said, okay, I'm toast. I can do whatever I want from now on. And that was it.
Oh man, this is gravy. Let's save this. Let's save this. I'm gonna hit record. Here we go. And boom, we're back for another episode of Alpha Cast. I'm Mike Winter, and I'm here as always with the wise and ever humorous Dr. Bear Paul Lando, coming to you live and direct from the great state of Jefferson, where freedom reigns supreme up here on the beautiful Smith River. Loving the weather. It's cooled down. Spring finally arrived. We had a spite of summer, really high temps, and now we're in this gorgeous mid-70s every day. I actually jumped in the river yesterday and the day before, Bear. It is brutally cold still. I needed an ice bath, though. It felt amazing.
Yeah, you got one.
A good old Asene cold plunge in the river.
Headache the other day.
Yeah, exactly. As Aaron just said, I was just going to say that, an Asene cold plunge. We're going to touch on that today, talking about the Essenes and how on point they were, understanding their relation to the elements, the elementals and all that. But yeah, exactly. I had a bit of a headache. I think a chemtrail headache. And
a
chemic do it to you.
Yeah, and it does wonders, man. Going in, and there's something about doing an ice bath. Traditional ice bath, of course, is phenomenal, as Bear knows from his old football days. But going into a living, pure water system like the Smith River when it's freezing cold, and having that water flowing through you and the life that it brings, the primary nature of it, the intelligence and the energy and the information that's talking to my living water inside my body. There's something magical about that. That's above and beyond sitting in a trough of chlorinated water from a hose with the ice you get from the store. It's a world of difference. So that's why I think surfers are so just righteously awesome, man. Totally righteous, cool.
Good vibes, bro.
Yeah, because they're getting that every day. Okay. We're here with Aaron Abke. Let's get started. Oh, by the way, we're 4 weeks out for Music in Sky. I already know, Aaron, you can't make it. Alec told me you got to.
I'm so bummed, dude. Don't bring it up. Sore spot.
All good, man. We'll get you out to one of these, but we're 4 weeks out. So excited. We keep adding little surprises here and there. We just added Gravity Glue to the lineup. He's this phenomenal natural sculpting alchemist who finds the 0 point between rocks and does these amazing sculptures, Bear, live with, like the rock stacking, but in ways that are just mind blowing. So he's going to be there doing live sculpture. and integrating that into the stage and all that. So it's just continual surprises that we're dropping on folks. It's really about the experience, and also coming out to meet Bear Lando live and in the flesh. That's very exciting. So musicandsky.com. And anything else, Bear, going on? We're working on, of course, on our private platform, getting out more content now that the sun's out and winter's over finally. The long, dark winter is over, and we will be getting more video content and other stuff on that platform. You can check that out at alphavedic.com/join-us. It's a phenomenal group in there, and thanks to everybody who's joined so far. Bear, anything else before we dive in?
No, we're good. Let's talk to Aaron. That's why we're all here.
Okay, awesome. Known by many names and traditions, we're going to be going, well, today I've titled this, The Essenes, Jesus, and the Science of Peace with Aaron Abke. Known by many names and traditions, the Nazarene left a living resonance in the ethers that would forevermore guide true seekers of the light. Beyond the misinterpreted words of Scripture by those coveting earthly authority, his message speaks directly to the heart. This time of new beginnings that he foretold has once again met the resistance of those who would quash his teachings under the guise of religion and quote-unquote science. As world events continue to expose the thinly veiled plans to enslave mankind, a new generation of intrepid souls have chosen to outwardly share the essence, as I almost said Asene, the Essenes of the Christ. Aaron Abke has repurposed his initial path as a fundamentalist pastor to become a paradigm-shifting spiritual teacher with a new perspective on self-realization through his teachings on the law of one, metaphysics, and spiritual intelligence. Hailing from a lineage of Christian pastors, Aaron graduated from Oral Roberts University with degrees in music and theology, but soon departed from his job as pastor to seek the deeper roots of spirituality through the Eastern traditions and practices. Aaron aims to provide humanity with the tools, knowledge, and practices needed to aid our collective ascension to enlightenment, also known as fourth density consciousness. Trigger alert, we're getting triggers right there. I can guarantee with saying that. His passion and purpose is to awaken this planet to the awareness of our oneness and collective destiny as enlightened civilization. On this episode, Aaron will take us on a historical and biblical journey to evidence that Jesus was in fact an Asene. We'll dive deeply into the spiritual path, diet, and lifestyle practices of the Essenes, and reveal how Paul's gospel hijacked this original movement of enlightenment. Bear Lando, we've been wanting to talk about the Essenes in Jesus for a long time. Looking forward to this one today. And you're muted, my friend. He's a rookie. Bear with us.
He's never done this before, right?
Sorry about that. I'm still learning.
All good, brother.
Aaron, awesome to meet you, and thanks for being with us. I was just saying while I was muted that the dietary part will probably trigger more people than anything.
You'll be surprised.
Aaron, believe me.
We have no shortage of triggers in today's conversation.
Yeah, there are, I've been around the health business for many years, and diets and health trends and fads come and go, and now we're in certain trending things. And so if you go against the trend, everybody gets very religious about it. So, but yeah, this is really going to be a good conversation. The Essenes have really been something I've been fascinated with for a long time, and also because their philosophy really is in alignment just with my own personal path. Mm-hmm. And you've had quite a journey from conventional, or we'll say fundamentalist Christian pastor, and then caught a little flack when you decided to just maybe not look elsewhere, but just widen your perspective a bit. So I guess my first question for you right out of the gate is, we're all, I really adhere to the teachings of Jesus. I have a special, personal relationship that I've developed since a child, growing up a Catholic, but then also through my own experience, really trying to read between the lines a little bit more from what I was taught in Catholic school, which brought me into a lot of more metaphysical studies and ascended master teachings and all sorts of things. And boy, talking about, triggering folks that, want to stay on, more the conventional path there. So in your own experience, since we're all supposedly accepting, the teachings of Christianity, peace and turn the other cheek and love your neighbor, all that kind of good stuff, and really listening to the words and, more important, the actions of Jesus, what is it that really sets people off when you just really, try to delve a little bit deeper and go out of the accepted boundaries there? Maybe if you can shed a little bit of light, if we're really adhering to Christian principles, it seems like we should be pretty forgiving and flexible with each other, but it seems to bring out the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, you have to first die to yourself, because it's that egoic self that gets in the way of truth, because we get identified with a position or a belief system. And that was what I saw in church growing up that caused me to begin questioning things, was that, first of all, just the unbelievable amount of contradictions between Paul's gospel and Jesus's gospel just began to just grate on me as I was turning, 18, 19, into my 20s. And I started asking more and more questions to every, Christian minister and pastor that I knew of. I wanted to get their answers on these things. And I was shocked at the unbelievably unsatisfying answers I would get for these questions that I thought were really important to be able to answer, and answer satisfactorily. And so at 23, I kind of made that choice to say, look, I can't get anyone to give me an answer that makes any sense to me or doesn't violate my own intuition. So I'm going to go find my own way, and I'm going to do my own research and follow where God is leading me through my intuition. And so I quit my church job and went back to Oklahoma and just spent like 4 years reading Enlightenment teachings, because I was really locked into the Christian paradigm so much that I didn't, you can't see the forest for the trees when you're in it. So I had to back up and say, let's just study, Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and see if there's correlations here to what Jesus was teaching. And sure enough, there absolutely were and are, because to me, there's only one religion. There's only one spirituality, which is, you can call it the law of one if you want. You could call it love if you want. But it's this idea of unity consciousness, that we're all children of the one eternal Father. And that God, that source, that creator is pure love. And so we all must love one another and walk in righteousness and in obedience to the law of one. And that emphatically was Jesus's gospel. Don't you dare confess me as Lord and Savior. And when you passed me by on the street when I was hungry and didn't feed me, don't dare come to me calling me Lord, Lord, when you didn't visit me in prison. Wait, so Jesus says that he's in the person who's in jail? But I thought people in jail were evil. Don't they need to confess him as Lord to be saved? No, you need to go visit them and love them because Jesus is in them. And Jesus said, if you don't do it, then get away from me, you who practice wickedness and lawlessness. So he was pretty unequivocal about this idea that my gospel, Jesus's gospel, was to love everyone, forgive everyone, and walk the way of life, the way of eternal life, which is to know God within yourself, to know the kingdom of heaven within yourself. And that gospel got hijacked by a person who never met Jesus and never had a conversation with Jesus, never heard Jesus's teachings in real life, but just had these kind of visionary experiences of Jesus where he said, hey, Jesus came to me in these dreams and he revealed to me the real gospel. And his real gospel is that he was God's final blood meat sacrifice that God needed to forgive people. And so all you have to do is confess Jesus as Lord, and boom, that's it. It's all you have to do. And then you're saved. And then we can move on and be Christians together. And the problem is that's not Jesus's gospel at all. And we can get into the kind of bifurcation that happened from the early Christian movement of basically the Asenian Christian movement, the early Christians that were basically, they were the Jewish Christians that the disciples and Jesus were ministering to. And then you had the pagan Greek Christians who Paul was ministering to that took this blood of Jesus, confess Jesus as Lord approach. And these two movements kind of duked it out for supremacy for about 300 years. And eventually, you know, it was a battle of ideas that the pagan Christians won because the Roman Catholic Church decided to choose that version of the gospel because it's, number one, way easier than Jesus's gospel. Number two, way more controllable and able to be weaponized by a government. And at 364 AD, we have the Council of Laodicea, where they made it illegal to practice Nazarene Christianity. They banned and outlawed all the Nazarene texts. And they said, if you're caught practicing Nazarene Christianity in Rome, you will be put to death on the spot. And that's kind of the last we see of the Asene movement in church history. And from there, it was only Paulianity, as I call it, that was allowed to be practiced, which is really just, again, the confession of Jesus's blood, confession as the Savior, get baptized, and then you're saved. We're all on the same team now. And it's just like amazing to me how Christians don't do their research to find out what was the original Christian movement? What were the original teachings of the 12 apostles? How were they spreading the gospel of Jesus? And was it different than Paul? And what we find is not only was it different, but they were actually in conflict with Paul all throughout their ministry because Paul was teaching this radically anti-Jesus gospel about blood sacrificing and all this stuff that Jesus was very outspoken against, about condemning blood sacrifices, and that this was the whole reason the Jews had deviated from God's law, was that they were practicing animal sacrifices. And Jesus is like, yo, isn't it written in your law? All your prophets said this. I don't desire sacrifices. I desire a broken and contrite spirit. I desire righteousness. And so that was what woke me up at a young age to the contradictions in my belief system that, you know, I never knew this Jesus that was preached on Sundays who, you know, kind of pictured in the book of Revelation. He's coming again on the clouds to slay his enemies with blood stained on his robe and his sword. He's going to kill all the unbelievers and take all the believers to heaven. And I was just in so much dissonance internally over that because I don't know that Jesus. I only know the Jesus I encounter in my heart, who is unconditionally loving. I only know the Jesus I see in the red letters of the Gospels, who says, if your enemy strikes you, turn the other cheek, forgive 70 times 7, go the extra mile, do not return evil for evil, but overcome evil with good. And again, that just couldn't be more different than the kind of, I call it Rambo Jesus, sometimes tongue in cheek, that Christians preach about. He's coming back. He's going to get vengeance, you know, on the unbelievers. So I just kind of said, I'm going to distance myself and do my own research. And really that led me some years later to discovering that Jesus was an Asene from the Nazarene community. And all the implications that has are absolutely massive, because when you know for certain that Jesus was an Asene, it isn't an argument. It isn't up for discussion. If you don't think he was an Asene, you haven't done any research, because there's an overwhelming amount of first century historians that document this in multiple volumes we can get into. There's an unbelievable amount of proof in the Bible itself that Jesus was an Asene. And so when you know that, you then have to study the Essenes to understand Jesus. And I think the cognitive dissonance Christians have is that they only study the Jesus of Paul, who again never met Jesus and persecuted and murdered Christians for a decade before he became the Apostle Paul. And so it's not that I have anything against Paul. It's just that this is what happened in church history, is that the Jesus movement bifurcated, and the original movement was squashed by the Roman church and the pagan Christians, and Paulianity eventually won out.
Yeah. So, you know, to understand this, I really want to get deeply into the Essenes, and to understand them, I think we have to understand also their lifestyle, their asceticism, and you know, just their philosophy. They're kind of the off-gridders of the day, and there's a reason why they separated from society. Now, at a certain point in your journey, you just intuited that there's more things I have to look into. And one of the things that you, I know, went into was just understanding law, real law, not legal. And that's another whole discussion for another time. But I think a lot of Christians are a little bit naive in that they do not know the ways of the world, and therefore do not perhaps know why, how and why Christianity was usurped. And, you know, it's all about just wanting, you know, freedom, and also understanding that there's no possibility of an earthly authority. We only answer to one, you know, entity, and that's God. So if we go into those studies, then of course all roads lead to Rome, and we get into the Vatican, the true role of the Vatican,
Yeah.
and that sheds a lot of light as far as why Christianity took a U-turn. Now, yeah, so a lot of us that have just adapted, further studies, like there's certain schools, I'm told that a century ago, that if your light had, let's just say, gone to a certain magnitude, you're invited in to be an initiate. And the first thing that you were obligated to learn were the ways of the world. You had to learn medicine, you had to learn law and finances, politics, because the whole idea was that if you do not understand that, then you're going to be vulnerable to those outer institutions and really not get to the heart of, what, spirituality is about in the first place. So let's answer one question here, possibly, which is, what would you say to folks that say the historical Jesus never existed in the first place?
That's a difficult one, honestly. I don't know what to say. It's when you encounter an argument that's so ignorant, sometimes it's best to just leave it alone. If people want to believe that, I don't need to convert them. Jesus is one of the most documented humans that's ever existed. And the idea that like somebody, like when you read Jesus's teachings in the Gospels, like they are unbelievably profound and enlightened, and they've lasted the test of time. So like some Joe Schmo trying to make up a religion in the first century or whatever the theory is, who's going to make up an entire enlightened teacher, like you have to be on that level of enlightenment to write teachings this remarkable. And enlightened beings don't forge documents, you know what I mean? Or make up religions. So like that alone is proof that someone clearly existed. It's like saying the Buddha never existed. It's like, well, then who was this unbelievably enlightened person who made all these teachings and left this incredible imprint on millions of people? Same as Jesus, right? So
yeah, we have a
argument I contend with in any way.
We have a tradition.
The only reason why I bring that up is because, we have some folks out in the peanut gallery that will be going there. So I just wanted to sort of get that one.
Let them go there, brother.
Mike, sorry. Go ahead. I spoke over you.
Well, no, I think it's important because we get that all the time in the quote unquote truther realm, right? Where people are arguing about the historicity of figures like Jesus. But we have a grand tradition in all moral religions that come from a human element of a divine human soul place, right? Like you said, mentioned Buddha, Moses, Zoroaster, who I want to touch on today, or Zarathustra, who has a definite connection to not only the Essenes through the Vend Astra and that tradition in Mithraism. There's a lot of traditions that all kind of come together here. There's a sort of through line, right? Through these different individuals. And so the historicity, we can go into the weeds on all that. But in the end, as you were saying, the important part here is the message, is the philosophy, right? The way, as Jesus would say.
The way.
Or the way.
Yeah.
And that through line, what some would call the perennial philosophy, right? That even touches on, what Socrates and Plato brought forth, the Neoplatonists and the alchemists, and it goes back to Hermeticism. And all of this is all tied in from the exact message that Jesus delivers in the true Gospels. And I want to touch on that today too, and we'll maybe get in the Nag Hammadi a bit and the Dead Sea Scrolls and all this stuff. But in the end, there is a core philosophy involved here that we're going to touch on that is congruent with the Essenes. And is important for us to really narrow on, because that is what we can apply in our lives.
Yeah.
So we can argue about the historicity all we want, but how are we applying the teachings in our lives?
And I would just quickly add to that, the academics are fun. I love it. But the truth is an actual direct resonance that speaks to your heart. And that's the way you really get it. And it has nothing to do with our linear thought processes. So please go ahead, Aaron, your thoughts.
So my thoughts on the historicity, or what was the question?
Well, yeah,
I was just going off.
Well, I mean, I think
was
it's
saying.
good just to, cover essentially your perspective on when you say the Gospels. There's a lot of, honestly, there's a lot of debate about, how the Gospels were bastardized. And then we've got things like the Nag Hammadi, like the Gospel of Thomas. It's interesting. That text seems to really be more in line with what we'll talk about later today, which is the Asene Gospel of Peace, right? And those core teachings of Jesus and those texts versus what we kind of have in the canonical modern Bible, New Testament.
Yeah. It's a big subject to tackle because it's so complex and nuanced. And again, these are the nuances that religious people don't care to look into because they don't probably want to know the actual truth behind the matter, because it can quickly destruct or destroy a religious ideology. When you trace back, like, how did these texts come about? Where did they come from? Biblical scholars will begin with the idea of Q, the lost gospel of Q, which was like the source that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John share together. And there's no doubt that the gospels we have in the New Testament are like Pauline works of some of Paul's disciples in the late first, early second century that were trying to weave in Paul's theology into the gospels. When you take just Q, which are the passages that those four share in similarity, they were clearly borrowing from an original earlier gospel, which I believe, and a lot of historians, there's a lot of historical proof to show that this was called the Gospel of the Holy 12, the 12 apostles. It makes sense that there would have been an original gospel written by the disciples that say, hey, we got to commemorate our master so that all of time and all the future generations can read about him and what he taught and what he did. So let's write our story of our life with the master. And so they wrote these passages we have in the New Testament that, again, in that 364 AD, Council of Laodicea, the year before the Council of Nicaea, where they instituted the Bible, they banished all Essene, Nazarene, and anything they deemed to be a heretical text. And so the Gospel of the Holy 12 was not only not included, but it was banned and was probably burned and taken out of history by that approach, which all banned books for the Roman Catholic Church had to be burned, and kind of an inquisition would be started to get rid of those texts. It was kind of like the original version of censorship, right? As you burn the books that teach against what you're trying to proselytize. So the original Gospel of Q was essentially lost because of that. But when you look at Q, it doesn't have any Pauline theology in it. It's just stories about Jesus and his morality teachings and his miracles and whatnot. And then you get Paul's influences when you get to communion, the communion at the Last Supper and things like that. And then, of course, the death and resurrection. So although the Gospels do give us like a great picture of Jesus and probably many, many, many true sayings, teachings, and stories of Jesus, I don't think they paint the full picture, because even in the Gospel of John, at the end of the book, it says, if every story about Jesus was written down, the whole world couldn't contain all the different miracles and stories and experiences that people had with him. So we're getting a tiny snapshot in the Gospels. But even when you compare the Gospels to Paul's works, they're very divergent and different from one another. So I think we can look at the Gospels as a lot of historical proof, but we also need to look at things like the Gospel of Thomas, which dates earlier than even the Gospel of Mark, which is kind of just a collection of sayings of Jesus. And there's some really telling passages in there, one of which being Jesus pronouncing his brother James to be the leader of his movement. And James was the leader of the Christian movement after Jesus, the early Jewish Christian movement, until he was killed in the early 60s AD. And James and the apostles were kind of scrubbed out of early church history. And it was all about Paul, and Paul being the appointed one, because he came to Jesus in visions and stuff. But that wasn't who Jesus appointed to be the new leader of his movement. So I look at those texts. I look at texts like the Didache, which I think is probably the most important non-biblical text that there is to give us a picture of this early Jewish Christian movement, because the Didache means the teaching in Greek. And the full name of the Didache text is called The Teaching of the 12 Apostles. And when you read it, it's not a very long read. It almost made it into the Bible, but in 365 AD, the Council of Nicaea decided not to include it because it doesn't contain any Pauline theology in it. It has nothing about Jesus being the blood sacrifice, confessing him as Lord. end time rapture stuff. None of Paul's theology. It's just the moral teachings of Jesus, which they call the way of life or the way of righteousness. And it gives you a picture of like, this is what the early Christians, James and the apostles, were teaching people was Jesus's gospel. It was about the righteous living and following the way of Jesus, which is why the Essenes were also called followers of the way. So the way is like a spiritual path. It's not a one-time, I confessed this thing, I believe this thing, now it's all done. No, it's a daily living the path. It's the way, every day I follow the way of Christ. And as I follow the way of Christ, I become like Christ. And so that to me is the crux of the matter when it comes to the Gospels, is like, what is the real message Jesus was trying to get across? Was it, I'm going to be murdered by God for your sins? You have to confess me as Lord, or you will burn in hell forever. Jesus never said any of that or anything remotely close to that. In fact, he chastised people for bringing up ideas like that. And so I think that's where most of our attention is best spent. When we want to understand who Jesus was, what he really taught, we have to backtrace that early Christian movement. And again, a lot of those streams go back to the Essenes.
It's also interesting that an Eastern philosophy that's termed the Tao also translates into the way. So I think a lot of
nice parallels there.
Were following natural design for sure. So was Jesus originally born into the Essene community, or how did that timeline work?
I believe he probably was, most likely. We don't know for sure, but he definitely, if he wasn't born as an Essene, he definitely became an Essene. But I think in the Gospel of Mark, it says he was born in Nazareth. And that's one of the two sects of Essenes in the first century. There was the Nazarenes to the north, and then the southern sect was called the Oseans. And there's extensive writings about the Nazarenes and the Oseans. And when you get to, I think, Matthew and Luke, they then put Jesus's birthplace in Bethlehem, because again, this selective text editing, especially by Paul's disciples, was rampant in the first century. Of we've got to make this guy look like he fits the Jewish bill for the Messiah, because all these Jewish Christians aren't accepting him as the Messiah. So we've got to make it look like he was according to them. So like, just kidding, he wasn't born in Nazareth. He was born in Bethlehem, just like the prophecies say. And there's all these new additions that change as you go through the Gospels. And one of them is his birthplace. The virgin birth is another one. There's no virgin birth in Mark, I believe, and then it kind of is introduced after that. So I think
we also, Aaron, have the Mithraic tradition that was heavily influencing Rome at that time, right? And because there's a lot of similarities between the Mithraic Mithras sort of creation story and that like Jesus in a manger story, and a lot of that mythos that was integrated in later.
For sure. Yeah. There's a ton of influence happening in the first century, because you have the Romans who are heavily influenced by the Greeks, obsessed with the Greeks, copied and mimicked the Greeks and everything. So you have Greek, everyone spoke Koine Greek, they're in Rome. You've got the Jewish tradition. So you've got paganism and Judaism kind of mixing, and a lot of that shows up in the New Testament in the way Jesus teaches. There's like the story of Lazarus, for example, that Christians love to use as like, oh, see, Jesus taught about hell. But in the story, it doesn't say, this one guy didn't confess me as Lord, so he goes to hell. The other guy confessed me as Lord, he went to heaven. No, he says, this guy was poor, he went to heaven. This guy was rich, he went to hell. That doesn't sound like Paul's gospel. Well, that's because he was doing what's called an inversion. Because in the modern day belief system of the Greek belief system was that those who are rich and wealthy and have high status are favored by the gods. Those who are sick, poor, destitute, they have bad karma, they're disfavored by the gods. And so people had this arrogance of like, the poor deserve to be poor, the sick deserve to be sick. It's what the gods have done to them. Let them have their punishment. The rich, those are the ones we should aspire to be like, because they clearly have the favor of the gods. So Jesus was constantly inverting that on its face, saying, hey, rich people go to hell, poor people go to heaven. Right away, people are like, what? And he tells this story about the rich man looking up to Lazarus, being, help me. And he says, hey, when I was on earth, you didn't help me. There it is again. Jesus's true gospel is to help the least of these, to love everyone, to love the least of these. So that's, like the term hell is from Norse mythology of the god Hel, Hel, ruling the underworld hell. It's very similar to Hades in Greek, the underworld Hades, ruled by the demigod Hades. So he was using Greek mythology to teach a parable because his audience was highly Greek and Greek influenced. So yeah, not only do you have that, but you have all the melting pot of Middle Eastern influences from Syria and even probably Tibet and India. It was quite a melting pot in those days, to say the least.
And what would you, in your studies, as far as the lineage of Jesus, his parents, possible marriage partners, siblings, what can we say about that?
Not a whole lot, honestly. I don't think the biblical in Matthew, he gives the genealogy tracing back Jesus to David, because again, you've got to show that Jesus comes from the line of David, or the Jews are like, we're out. You're not convincing us he's the Messiah. We know the Messiah is coming from the line of David. And so whoever wrote Matthew, he jumps around a lot, uses a lot of women instead of men, which is like not something you would do back then, to try and say, look, if you follow the women, he really was on the line of David. So like, I don't give a lot of credit to that. I don't think it's a reliable genealogy, but nonetheless, like, it doesn't really matter to me what his lineage was, obviously, what his bloodline was. What to me matters is the community that he was born in. What did they practice and believe? Because that's how he would have been raised and conditioned. And when you read the Gospels and some of these first century writers like Philo and Pliny and Josephus, they go through many of the Asene creeds and name them word by word. These are the Asene creeds that they practiced and followed and taught. And Jesus quotes over 7 of them in the New Testament, word for word, according to Asene creeds, which is one of the biggest pieces of evidence to me that was his lineage and where he was born and raised.
Mm-hmm. So as far as the Essenes, and let's just maybe get a little bit into their whole culture, if we could. And, their philosophy, which we're touching on already, but their lifestyle and maybe the reasons behind it, their whole body culture, as we might call it. And maybe could we open that up a little bit, open up a can of worms for the folks that, believe there's certain ways we should, live and eat. And, now I've, read the teachings of the Gospel of the Essenes and, know a little bit about it, but just from your perspective, because I know you've gone a lot deeper, what was their lifestyle like, and what were the reasons for it?
Mm-hmm. Well, when you get into this question, you have to kind of make a distinction between the Oseans and the Nazarenes, because I believe Philo lived with the Oseans for 3 years. And so there was definitely like a huge amount of crossover, but there were some key principles that those two sects disagreed on, which is why they kind of separated. And they were brothers to each other. They were in good relationship. They were just like, hey, you guys kind of believe this, we believe that. Let's have our own sects, but we're still Essenes. We're still brothers of light. And the big one was the belief in marriage. The Oseans were like strict against marriage. They were very much like against women having equal standing with men, because they believed women created sin and temptation and all that. So they were like strict celibates in the South. And Pliny kind of makes light of that in a few of his writings in a tongue-in-cheek way. The Nazarenes were the opposite, and they believed heavily in the discipline of marriage as being essential to carrying the tradition forward and to achieving their ultimate goal, which was, their belief was that the reason that man grows old and sick and dies is because man has deviated so far from God's law. They call it the holy law, the invisible law, that we have corrupted our body, and our body shows our deviation through its sickness and its old age and all of that. And they believe that the deviation actually began with Abraham, who is the father of Judaism. Abraham was not the father of the Essene Jews, but Enoch was who they claimed as the father of their faith. Because in the book of Genesis, there's just one line about Enoch, which says, Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. And the Essenes were like, hey, that's our guy, because he walked with God, and he walked so closely with God that God took him back up to heaven. So Enoch kind of has a Christic image to him of ascending to heaven, like almost before Jesus did. And they believe that when it got to Abraham, and that whole story of Abraham believing that God asked him to kill his own son to show his loyalty to God, and Abraham says, okay, I'll murder my son for you, God, that was when the Jews really deviated, or when mankind began to deviate from the holy law, because God would never ask anyone to murder somebody, and God sure doesn't need to murder someone for you to prove loyalty. Those are very like demonic ideas in the eyes of the Essenes. And so they believe that Jews were heavily influenced by the evil one, whether that's Satan or whatever the name is you want to call it. The forces of darkness, they believed, had corrupted Judaism. And it began with Abraham thinking that God asked him to kill his own son. And when you fast forward through Moses and into the first century, the practice of animal sacrifices had gotten so out of control that Josephus writes in his, I believe it's his Wars of the Jews text, that on every, not Sabbath, but one of the holy days of Judaism where they would sacrifice the animals, that in the temple in Jerusalem, they would sacrifice 250,000 goats in one day. And he wrote about how they needed to have like trenches dug to funnel the blood out of the temple, because the entire temple would just be filled and washed everywhere with blood, and it would take them probably weeks to clean it all up. So they eventually built trenches to flow the blood out of the temple, because they were slaughtering so many animals. And you get this picture of like this violent, grotesque animal sacrifice cult ritual taking place. And the Essenes are like, you guys think that this is what the creator wants? Like genocide and death is what the creator wants? No, you guys are so far from the truth. God wants righteousness and purity in your heart. And you don't need anything outside of that to be pure. Nothing outside of you can save you or make you pure. So they were trying to get back to natural law, which they believe the Jews had lost. And that's why they estranged themselves into the Qumran Valley, into this burning wasteland of the Qumran Desert by the Dead Sea, because they wanted to stay away from the darkness taking place in Jerusalem. And so they believe that enough generations of us living according to the holy law, living physically, spiritually, and mentally pure, we will extend the human lifespan gradually back to its original intention, which was always meant to be about 1,000 years per lifetime. And now we live, less than a tenth of that original intended lifespan because of our great accumulated sin and negative karma. So they were trying to undo where we all went wrong. And boy, were they succeeding. Because when you read Josephus and Philo, who document the way these people lived and how healthy they were, they both say that the average Asene in those days was living to be 120, the average person. So you had Essenes that were probably living to be 200 years old, and 120 years old is already about double the lifespan of the average person in those days. So what they were doing was definitely working. But I think there was a deeper philosophy for the Essenes, which some of their writings indicate, if you read between the lines, that they really did believe that they were a messianic sect for sure. They were an apocalyptic messianic sect. That's one thing that all scholars agree on with the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls, that this group of people were clearly messianic and apocalyptic. And we'll get into both of those. But they believed that a Messiah would be born among them, who would eventually be the living demonstration of their purity that they had worked for, that there would be essentially a kind of avatar human that would be purified and crystallized from birth and would show all the efforts of, about 300 years of Asene ritual living and what they had worked for. And so Jesus is probably John the Baptist was their first one. And John was like, no, it's not me. It's actually Jesus. Just became the fulfillment to them of that prophecy that they would eventually have an avatar being born among them. And I think that they believed that there's a lot of celestial beings who want to incarnate on Earth to help Earth and help save humanity. but we don't have a physical body that can house that level of frequency yet. So we've got to improve the physical body so it can be a container for this incredibly high frequency that these beings are operating from, so they can incarnate here. We got to make the vessel for them. And so they all shared in this, they all participated in this endeavor, right? Because each one of us has to live that purity and then pass it down to our children, teaching them how to live according to it so that they can pass it down and they can pass it down. And as we pass down inner and outer purity, physical and spiritual purity, we know this now through science, we upgrade the genetic codes, the genomes of the human DNA, so that we can more and more express the divinity that is inherent in us in potential. So that was really the Nazarenes' philosophy, and why they were doing what they were doing by isolating themselves in the Qumran Valley and learning how to heal and perform healing and live strictly an aesthetic lifestyle. There was a really rich and beautiful philosophy behind it all. And what's funny is people will write them off because they confuse the Essenes with the Nazarenes a lot of times. Say, oh, those kooky, crazy people, they were celibates, they didn't even get married. And I think that the Nazarenes get a bit of a bad rap because of the Essenes, and a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls came from the Essenes versus the Nazarenes. But anyway, so those are just like a few of the dichotomies and contrasts between the two sects. But Jesus, thankfully, was born in the Nazarene sect and really did a good job of like demonstrating their philosophy, not just in the Essene gospel of peace, but even in the New Testament.
And Jesus also taught, I don't want to make this about just physical lifestyle things, because obviously the inner work is the most important, but it is important, as you already said, to, prepare the physical temple as well. So what hygienic practices did Jesus teach to the Essenes?
So when you read the Essene gospel of peace, the first gospel, there's 4 books in that Essene gospel. And the first one is just the most fascinating read if you're into homeopathy and naturopathic medicine and health, because it's basically just Jesus giving this incredible dissertation on homeopathy. And, he begins talking about, it's a bunch of sick people, right? They come to Jesus and they're like, Lord, help us. We're so sick and ill and we don't know what we've done, but we can't heal ourselves. And we know that you can heal us. Please show us the way. And Jesus says, basically, the reason y'all are sick is because you're inviting demons into your body by eating and taking in those things which are impure and defile your temple. And now the demonic energy, or whatever you want to call it, is locked in your body, causing illness. So you've got to purify and detox your body by returning back to communion with the earthly mother's angels. And so Jesus said, blessed are you who ask for wisdom, for I will give you the bread of wisdom, and I will teach you how to walk in the way of the earthly mother's angels. And he goes on this explanation of the 7 angels. And they're basically the 4 elements. We have the angel of air, angel of water, angel of sunlight, which is like fire element, and then the angel of earth. And then you have the angel of joy, the angel of life, and then the earthly mother is the 7th. And he gives the explanation of what each one of these, they're called angels, malachim in Hebrew, which really is just a metaphorical way for saying like these spiritual powers that exist, these archetypes, right? The elements are an archetype, not an angel. But angel is just a convenient summary of these spiritual powers, and that we have to commune with these powers if we want to have life and health, because our body's made of these powers. Our body functions by these powers. And basically, you guys have wandered so far away from your earthly mother, aka natural law, that of course you're sick. You can't be healthy if you deviate from your earthly mother. And so he teaches them how to fast. He teaches them how to do water fasts, baptism, water cleansing, enemas, if you can believe it. And at one point near the end of the gospel, what's that?
Yeah, he taught him how to use gourds and vines in order to do internal cleansing.
Pretty amazing stuff for, first century. And, they do what he says, they get cleansed and healed, they praise God, they thank Jesus. It's a really cool gospel that paints a totally different picture of Jesus as being somewhat of a health guru as well, which if he came from the Essenes, which we know for a fact that he did, then he would have been quite an expert on health, because the Essenes were experts in health. I mean, we have, again, multiple first century historians like Josephus and Philo writing that kings and rulers and leaders and oligarchs from all over the land would send for Essenes when they were sick to come and heal them. And people would travel from far and wide to come to the Essene community who needed healing, because they were widely known as being powerful healers, not just with supernatural healing by the laying on of hands and transmutation of energy like Jesus did, but naturopathic healing and living according to natural law. And I think the Essenes probably started with that and then got into the spiritual healing from there, because I think they would have understood, like, if you're out of alignment with natural law, you have no business doing anything else first. Like, get back into alignment with truth and law, and then we can do some hands-on healing and all of that. But I think that was their essential doctrine, was live in alignment with the law.
Could we tap into a little bit and back up on the Essene gospel of peace, where it comes from, sort of the historic implications of it, because it's a phenomenal read. I was actually gifted this by Eric Casano. Shout out to Eric if you're listening. Dr. Shivambu himself. And it's this is the complete 4 books in 1 volumes. But I'd love to get in a little bit of the history of how this was discovered, the man behind it.
Yeah.
Because what's cool about that is, as we go through this, then we're going to tap into other traditions that synchronistically work with the Essene tradition, that being Zoroaster, and going back thousands of years, to this concurrent theme about the 16 forces and the elements. And it's a very practical, pragmatic, natural inclination of mysticism here, or a use of mysticism that isn't so much about these heady concepts. It's literally tying into the forces of nature, right? Of water, earth, fire, air, and then like the mother and food and law and all these things. So yeah, where did this come from? The Essene gospel of peace.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, man. And if anyone wants to read the full story, you're going to want to get this book. It's called The Discovery of the Essene Gospel of Peace by Edmund Bordeaux-Zeckley. And it's a really beautiful story of, he talked about his upbringing, being a Catholic. He wanted to be a Catholic scholar and scribe and translator. So he had gone to school for that. And essentially he was really inspired and in love with St. Francis. And so he wrote, when he was 18, his final dissertation to graduate from his whatever high school is called back in those days in England. He wrote a dissertation on St. Francis, and it was incredibly passionate, beautifully written, and it really moved his head bishop at his Catholic school. And he said, hey, I'm going to send this to Cardinal Mercati at the Vatican to let him read it, because he also loved St. Francis, and see what he thinks of it, and maybe I can put in a good recommendation for you. So he sends Edmund Bordeaux's, document to Giovanni Mercati, or Monsignor Mercati, who was the presiding bishop over the Vatican secret archives in those days. And Cardinal Mercati says, wow, I love this. I want to meet this student. Please send him here. I'd love to have him do like an internship here. And so to his shock, he gets to be, interning under Cardinal Mercati at like 18, 19 years old. So he goes that summer, he travels to the Vatican and tells that story in the book, which is also a cool story. And basically, to summarize, he gets there and develops this beautiful relationship with Giovanni Mercati. And they kind of like a fatherly son type of relationship, that he really invests in Edmund Bordeaux. And he accounts or recounts many of their conversations and the teachings that Cardinal Mercati taught him. He said he was just a wonderful man, a man of God, a man of integrity and truth, and really, again, a disciple of St. Francis as well. And so at some point, in their conversations, Edmund Bordeaux was tracing back the original Christian history and trying to find where these teachings of Jesus came from. And Bishop Cardinal Mercati said, you have to find the original ocean that all the streams came from. So like St. Francis is a stream, a river coming from the ocean, but go deeper than St. Francis. Who did St. Francis get inspired by? And so he studied St. Francis, and he gave Edmund Bordeaux the keys to the Vatican archives, not the secret archives, but the regular ones. And he's digging up all these old texts and scrolls about St. Francis, and finds out that St. Francis was a huge student of St. Jerome and St. Benedict, who were like 3rd century Christian writers who were writing a lot about the early Christian movement, the Nazarene movement, followers of the way, and all of that. And he tells Bishop Cardinal Mercati about this, and he says, "Well done, my son. You've found the river. Now go find the ocean." And he gives him the key to the secret archives of the Vatican. And he tells him, you can go in there, you can pillage through the text, do all the researching you want. You can't take anything out of there because that's forbidden by the Vatican, but we'll let you dig in there, you know? So he goes digging through the Vatican secret archives and eventually finds this scroll called the Asene Gospel of Peace in Hebrew. And he had learned, I think he spoke like 5 languages at that time. He was like 20, 21. And he was pretty well versed in Hebrew, Aramaic, but he wasn't like super prolific. So he found this gospel that was written in Aramaic or Hebrew, one of the two. And he understood what it was called. He started reading through it and said, wow, this is amazing. I need to brush up on my Hebrew to understand this text. And he starts practicing his Hebrew and reading the text. And immediately he's like, this is unbelievable. This is world-changing stuff in this document. He approaches his Cardinal Mercati and says, would you allow me to translate this into English? And he says, of course. But again, you can't take it out of the Vatican. It has to stay here in our archives, but you can translate it. And so he began his work translating it. And he produced the first gospel, I think, in the late 30s, I want to say. He came on the scene. I'm going to Google that right now, actually. Or maybe you can for me, Mike. And then he starts on the second one, the third, and the fourth. And he eventually finished all of them by, I think, the 50s, the late 50s. Interestingly enough, he sent his second one to Aldous Huxley.
1928 was the first publication.
Okay, so this is huge. The fact that the first Essene Gospel was published in 1928, you said?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's huge because all of the naysayers about the Essene Gospel of Peace being a forgery, this is the fact that disputes that more than any other. Firstly, he names, you can do a lot of research on Giovanni Cardinal Mercati and, the years he lived in the Vatican and presided over the secret archives. He wrote like 400 texts in his lifetime or translated them. You can research a lot about this man. He and Edmond Bordeaux were very, very close, and he writes about him in the intro to the Essene Gospel of Peace and mentions him, and he translates this text. And Cardinal Mercati didn't pass away until 1957. And so if this document was a forgery, which is totally impossible, number one, but if it was a forgery that this guy just made up, then surely Cardinal Mercati would have come out and said, no, that's not true. I never gave this guy the keys. This is made up. I didn't do this. And never once did Cardinal Mercati denounce Edmond Bordeaux's works. And all 4 of the Gospels were published before he passed away. So that's number one. But number two, like anyone who thinks this document is a forgery just hasn't read it. They're a fundamentalist Christian who doesn't want it to be real because it dispels Christianity in so many ways. You haven't read it if you think it's a forgery because, well, I'll qualify that by saying, or you've read it and you just don't have the spiritual intelligence to see what you're reading. Because this text is an absolutely life-changing spiritual masterpiece that you could take the best 12 scholars on planet Earth, and they could never come up with something half this powerful. This text has a very ancient tone to it, but its spiritual principles are timeless. Kind of like you said, Mike, the golden thread, the perennial philosophy, they're all in there.
And it predates the Dead Sea Scrolls by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, by like 30 years. And Zeckley would say that there was a lot of proof then when those were discovered. I know there's people that argue the Dead Sea Scrolls, historicity again, like how legit they are and all that. And some even say it's a CIA operation or whatever. But that being said, like true scholars have broken this down and seen that actually there is a linguistic tie between the two. And it was actually Aramaic.
Yeah, that's right.
I believe from the 3rd century. He actually says here that it was from the content of his book represents only about 1/3 of the complete manuscripts which exist in Aramaic in the archives of the Vatican and in Old Slavonic in the Royal Archives of the Habsburgs. now the property of the Austrian government. We owe the existence of these two versions to the Nestorian priests who, under pressure of the advancing hordes of Genghis Khan, were forced to flee from the east towards the west, bearing all their ancient scriptures and icons with them. The ancient Aramaic texts date from the 3rd century after Christ, while the Old Slavonic version is a literal translation of the former. Exactly how these texts traveled from Palestine to the interior of Asia into the hands of the Nestorian priests, archaeology is not yet able to reconstruct for us. But so that's sort of the history of how that came across. Now, of course, people will say, well, it's through the Vatican, and how can we trust that? And that's why I think it's important, once again, as you're saying, Aaron, go to the text, read the text yourself, and see how it resonates with you, right? There is a resonance that comes out of it. And as Zeckley will later say, and what I love is he ties it into the ancient Zoroastrian religion as well. And that ties into the perennial philosophy and everything. So once again, there is a resonance to this that really reigns true when you read the text.
Yeah. Yeah, big time. And I mean, first of all, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, they literally call it the secret archives of the Vatican. And when you look, like if you do research on Cardinal Mercati, you'll look up, it'll say on his Wikipedia, he was the presiding cardinal over the secret archives of the Vatican. So they don't even pull the punches that they're hiding texts from the world. They use the air of their authority of like, we're the only ones who are allowed to keep these ancient texts. You people aren't responsible enough to read these. You'll get deceived, blah, blah, blah. We'll keep these safe from you. And so, of course,
supposedly they're from a lot of them are from the last fall of the Library of Alexandria.
Yes.
They were brought over.
I mean, I think one of the biggest discoveries that will ever happen for humanity is when someone's allowed, or if the Vatican collapses and people get in there and take those texts and we get to see the texts that they've been suppressing for thousands of years, is going to radically alter human history in ways we can't conceive of. But this gospel, the Asene gospel, is like one example of just the ammunition that they're holding back from humanity that could spell big trouble for them. So when Edmund Bordeaux published this, the Vatican had to come out and say, no, this wasn't our text. No, this is forgery, because it completely contradicts the Jesus of Catholicism. So they can't just let him claim that he found this in their library, right? So it shouldn't surprise anyone the Vatican says it's a forgery. But again, the cardinal was alive when he published all these texts for decades afterwards and never denounced them once. And so like the spiritual path that's laid out in the Asene gospel is nothing short of spiritual genius, and nobody with half an ego would write a text this brilliant and then not take credit for it. You know what I mean? And then secondly, like those rare beings who do have the level of enlightenment to write texts like these, those kinds of enlightened beings don't forge documents. So the idea that it's a forgery doesn't have a foot to stand on, in my opinion. But we also have like hard evidence from Edmund Bordeaux, and Aldous Huxley also got to see the second translation he made. Sorry, the first translation of the second gospel. He sent it to Aldous Huxley, and he publishes the letter that Huxley gives in response. So it really just comes down to the fact that he wasn't allowed, as part of the agreement of, hey, you can translate this, but you can't let this text out. You can't send it to different labs to carbon date it and all that. This has to stay in our secret archives. But if this is the ocean you believe that St. Francis was inspired by, the world needs to see this.
Well, I'll just say this, there's definitely a lot of congruency and synchronicity between the Gospel of Thomas and the Asene Gospel of Peace.
Lots.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dive a little deeper there, if you don't mind, the Asene Gospel of Peace, and what these angels are, and sort of what the message is, and how that relates to, once again, their diet and their lifestyle and this internal practice. Because really, they were like agrarian, permaculture philosophers. They were like these really amazing people. And I would say like even Thomas Jefferson was heavily influenced by them.
Yes.
He's known as a classicist, but really, like Zeckley talks about this, like Thomas Jefferson and the American Revolution was actually, I believe, in a way influenced by the Essenes and their lifestyle of agrarianism.
Sure. Yeah. And Thomas Jefferson was also very anti-Paul and Paulianity. he was like, yo, this guy Paul totally missed Jesus. I'm just going to read the red letters and probably the Essenes as well. And I'm going to be good with that. Like, that's the real Jesus path. So yeah, I mean, the Essenes were
Paul's
again
definitely not a libertarian Jeffersonian, that's for sure.
for sure. The Essenes had the messianic aspect, and then they had the apocalyptic aspect. And we touched on the messianic aspect, the apocalyptic aspect to them. And when you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a lot of texts about the end of the age that's coming very soon, the end of the age of darkness, they said, because they were very tapped into the political temperature of the day they lived in. And if you study, you know, what happened in the first century, it was crazy barbaric time to be alive in the first century, with just nonstop violence between the Romans and the Jewish zealots, and all these overthrow attempts that would get squashed by the Roman government. So you not only had the Jews who they believed were practicing black witchcraft, demonic witchcraft, by sacrificing and killing animals to atone for sins, but also that they were constantly poking the bear of the Roman Empire, being like, you guys are evil. We're supposed to be God's favorite nation. We're going to take you over and take our nation back. And Jesus and the Essenes were like, oh boy, karma's coming, y'all. And they kind of like, they could smell it. They could feel it in the air, right? So they were warning people about it. And what's funny is the number one passage in the New Testament that Christians use to preach about the rapture is Matthew 24. And when you read Matthew 24, it couldn't be more clear what Jesus is talking about. He's talking to the first century Jews who were actually listening to him in real life. And he's warning them about this coming destruction and the end of the age, the aeonios, the age, he says, which was the end of the age of the Jews living under Rome. He's like, yo, Rome's going to come and kill all of us very soon. So like, be ready for this and flee to the mountains when they come. And he gives warnings to pregnant women and people working in fields. And he says that it's going to be a destruction unlike you've ever seen before, that the world has never seen before. And he also said not one stone will be left upon another in the temple. So the Jews hated that. And they're like, don't you dare blaspheme our holy temple by saying the Romans, the pagans are going to destroy it. And they got really angry at Jesus for saying that. But that's because this is what the Essenes had been saying for a long time. They're like, this karma is only going to last so long. And the Jews, they're going to get what's coming to them. And so they were
Essenes understood cause and effect.
100%. That was what it was. It wasn't the apocalyptic ideology of Paul, which like Paul believed in this really kooky, wacky idea that Jesus is going to be coming back from the clouds. We're going to see him floating down from heaven. A trumpet will sound and we'll all be caught up in the air. And our physical bodies will transform into these new kind of spiritual bodies. And we will all ascend with Jesus up to heaven, just like he ascended. And he gave this whole idea of like Jesus being this first Adam, he said, of this new generation of spiritual beings. And we're all going to be like that. And Paul was like, it's happening in our lifetime. Do not get married. Do not get a new job. If you're a slave, who cares? You only have a few years max before Jesus comes back. And Paul was like emphatic that this was happening in his lifetime. And of course, he was extremely wrong. It never happened because it was a crazy idea. But that was not at all like the word apocalypse gets associated with Paul's theology of the apocalypse. The Essenes had no such belief in this coming Messiah from the heavens. It was all about the end of the age of darkness, and specifically the darkness of the Judaistic culture, having strayed so far from God. They're like, you can only live out of alignment with God's laws for so long before the universe will wipe you out. It's just karma. It's the way it works. And boy, were they correct. Because in 70 AD, the Roman Empire was like, we're sick and tired of these freaking Jews killing our soldiers in the desert. Let's extinguish them. And they sent the full might of the Roman Empire to Jerusalem in 70 AD. And they slaughtered 1.1 million Jews in one day. Imagine the bloodbath.
All the you know what's being cut off and sucked on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They wiped out the temple. They killed all the Jews they could get their hands on, crucified them on the hills. The battle is unbelievable to read about. Like somebody has to make a movie about this because the Jews,
temple.
Yeah, like it was like 300. If you've seen that movie, it was like a few 100,000 Jewish soldiers against, the entire Roman army. and they were sequestered in Jerusalem around their walls, protecting their temple. And they held off the Roman army for like months with all these crazy tactics, like digging tunnels under the dirt for like half a mile to flank the Roman army at night and kill them at night. And so the Roman army, just Vespasian had to keep on sending more troops until they eventually they broke through the walls and then leveled everything to the ground, killed every man, woman, and child they could get their hands on, and crucified them on the hilltops and stuff. So the Essenes like knew this was going to happen, and they were warning people about it in their text. They're like, we don't know when it's going to happen, but it is going to happen. And here's the signs you're going to see, knowing that this event is forthcoming.
Yeah. Wow.
So just to complete what Mike asked a minute ago, what we're kind of hedging around, which is, the last of their lifestyle practices, dietary and so forth. Were they flesh eaters, or did they refrain from eating meat? And the only reason why I'm interested in that is, just more the reasons why behind whatever they did.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Essenes were strict vegetarians. And in fact, the whole early Christian movement were strict vegetarians. And Paul writes about this a few different times in his epistles about like, hey, if you're around these Jewish Christians, they don't eat meat, just do what they do, don't offend them, etc. And that's because, again, the Essenes wanted to follow God's original law. And Moses gave that original law, which one of the commandments, I think the third commandment, is thou shalt not kill. And they were strict on that. Like, what God has made alive, let no man kill. Jesus says that in the Essene gospel. And a big part of the karma he tells people that they've earned that's causing them to be sick is from killing animals and eating flesh. And he goes into that quite a bit in the first gospel by saying, like, he who eats the body of death, he who eats the flesh of beasts eats the body of death. And death can only produce death, whereas life can only produce life. And so Jesus gives this kind of dietary lifestyle that I conveniently call the Jesus diet, where he says, here's what the Creator designed for us to eat. And he kind of gives these rules of like, here's how you know what you're supposed to eat according to natural law. You will not have to murder anything to eat it. Number two, it's something that will be in great abundance, and it'll be alive when you eat it. And so that's like, obviously, fruits and vegetables meet those criteria. But he mentions milk, raw milk, quite a bit. Actually, he mentions it more than any other food. It was probably his favorite food, I think. And he says the milk of all animals is good for man's consumption and is designed for man to consume. Cows, goats, they produce way more milk than even their own calves can feed upon. So like the leftover milk was meant for man, Jesus is saying. He doesn't mention eggs, but eggs meet all the criteria he lays out. I don't know if eggs were even like something that Jews partook in those days, or if they had chickens or whatever. But eggs are in mega, mega, mega abundance. We know that. One chicken will produce like 50,000 eggs in their lifetime. An egg yolk is still alive when you eat it. It's got all the nutrients in it to be fertilized and turn into a chicken. And you don't have to murder anything to eat the egg, right? So milk and eggs for me, are like the two staples for the Jesus diet. But then, of course, fruit is also really high up. Honey was really high on Jesus's list. He mentions honey a lot. And we know honey is a remarkable superfood and really good for male and female hormone health. And then fruits, vegetables, herbs, seed-bearing herbs, pretty much basically anything but eating meat would be probably okay with Jesus. But it's because of the karmic implications of having to kill something in order to eat is a violation of the law of one, of do no harm to any living creature. And so it was more of a spiritual reason than anything. I don't think Jesus would have argued that eating meat is like bad for you or something. We know, like, through the science of studying how the body interacts with meat, it's not bad for you if it's organic and grass-fed. It has lots of nutrients, high nutrient density. The point is that it doesn't have the life force energy in it anymore, because when you slaughter an animal, the consciousness leaves the body. And so the prana in the cells of the animal you're eating is gone. So you're eating like empty vitamins, minerals, and nutrients without that elixir within it. But when you're eating like fruit and vegetables, etc., these things have the prana in them. And it's the prana that actually elevates our frequency and extends the lifespan. So there is a lot of research showing that people who eat high consumptions of meat can live a healthy quality of life, but it will have a shorter quantity of life, meaning it will shorten the lifespan. Because again, you are eating death. You're eating something that's dead, right? Versus eating things that are alive when you eat them will extend the lifespan. So it was probably more for them about, following natural law and the way the creator intended us to eat. This is never an indictment on people that eat meat. Like, I was eating meat in January of this year. It hasn't been that long that I've been off meat. It just has to be an internal, I think, thing for people that you have to come to that conclusion of your own self and say, hey, it just doesn't resonate with me anymore to do this. And that's the right time to do it. And if you don't feel that, you shouldn't make yourself stop eating meat from guilt or something. I certainly don't try to make any converts about this. I just think that it has to be a personal spiritual decision that you come to of your own conclusion.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And, we talk a lot about diet just because we're a health and wellness channel, first and foremost. And in my years of practice, I never really tried to push people in either direction. In the old martial arts communities and, something that I spend a lot of time in, there are vegetarians. These are the most badass warriors on the planet back in the day. But they had fish ponds. So if somebody was convalescing, they would, maybe eat fish in order to, use it as a tonic. But it wasn't an everyday staple. I don't know, what you know about the, another, who I would consider another great luminary on this planet who behind the scenes has allegedly worked hand in hand with Jesus in his ministry, which was Saint Germain. And Saint Germain has a lot, during his lifetime and before his ascension, he didn't even eat food for a long time. But he also taught that eating meat was, you're taking in that chemistry that the adrenaline mostly that is prevalent in the meat, because just right before the start, so you are eating fear. And, myself in my own athletic career, and I competed in different sports for a long time. And I stopped eating meat right after I stopped playing football, and I dropped down from about 285 to, held in competition days and fighting and things at, maybe about 220, and was, maybe vegetarian for the last 45 years. And I can just say from personal experience, it doesn't at all drop off your stamina. I would say, in fact, it improves. You can maintain healthy, lean body mass. And I just think there's a lot of misinformation out there. And, the most intelligent thing I ever heard about diet of any type was that, food will do exactly to you what you think it will do. So, so many people now are going into the pure carnivore lifestyle, again, which is fine. I have no problem with that. But in the health business, I find that it does really affect your longevity. And, it takes a lot more energy to process. And even though you get a lot of good, dense nutrition and tonifying effects from it, you're in fact kind of lowering the threshold of your overall resonance, we'll just say.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
and processing the meat, it actually creates a net energy loss. Whereas when you eat alive things, you get more of a net energy gain. And one thing I'm sure about, as far as a healthy body, it's about preserving energy, gathering energy, and not leaking energy. And then that being said, what comes out of your mouth is a lot more important what you put into it, no matter what your diet is. So anyway, I just wanted to get that out of the way and not challenging anybody out there, but in the Ascended Master teachings, which includes the teachings of Jesus, they all seem to adhere to a vegetarian lifestyle. And
well, also,
it just seems to make sense.
There, I'll say too, a lot of the advocates for the carnivore diet are looking purely from a chemistry perspective, a very sort of materialistic, modern scientific perspective, where the Essenes, and I would say also the Zoroastrians and a lot of the great sort of spiritual traditions understood the energetics on a much deeper level. And going back to Zeckley, he talks about the biotic the biotics of the energetics of young plant life, and how they have like what Wilhelm Reich would call an orgone energy, or what we're calling chi or prana.
Yeah.
And actually, they had a whole technology around the biotic energy and how they would use that to power themselves. And this is actually, Zeckley talks about creating a biotic battery, where you create sort of like a microgreen, a little plant that you can carry around with you, and then it's generating, because it's early life force, it's generating a measurable energetic. And actually, here is a illustration of the biotic battery, and it's so simple. It's just essentially like wheatgrass, right? That you then hold on to, and you let the energetics actually go into your biology while you pray or meditate.
Amazing.
He would actually fly with this in airplanes to counteract the radioactivity and the radiation, excuse me, that you get when flying. And he wouldn't have those ill health effects you get after a long flight, because he actually was based in Costa Rica and would go back to Canada and US and fly a lot. And so anyways, I've been researching more on the biotic technology that the Essenes used back in the day. And that's why we feel so good when we're gardening and when we're, interacting and engaging with plant life. And why also the Alfa Vedic here. Oh, we never do this, Bear, but here's an Alfa Vedic product plug. And I know, Aaron, you've actually used some of our products. Our protein blend, our protein blend is using seeds, fruit seeds, and pollens and things that have that biotic energetic in it, and that is a core component to our protein blend.
And the non-vegan ones have raw dairy from goat and so forth, and colostrum. Somebody in the chat just came up with the typical comment, and we'll move on into other things here, but just to address this, they say, well, if you're eating plants, you're still taking a life. Well, the plant kingdom is not comprised of individualized souls. It is maybe you could call it a collective consciousness that creates this in nature as a different kind of life form. It's not an individualized soul as in the animal or human kingdom that has any ability to have sentience on a different level. So you're really not, killing in the same way at all. And I hear that all the time. And it's sorry for the person in the comments, but it's really nonsense.
And can I add one more thing to that real quick?
You add something, and then I'm going to add something.
The Asene way, when you're living the Asene way and you are directly interacting with growing your food and not buying your vegetables at Whole Foods from mass ag that are slaughtering small animals and things through their large harvesting mechanisms and stuff. Yeah, like a lot of little rabbits and rodents and stuff get murdered by those large systems. But when you are directly working with the land and growing your own food and doing it with the compassion, then those little animals and stuff, yes, we know the dead carcasses and the bacteria and all that stuff make the soil healthy and all that. And that's the circle of life. But you're not out there murdering bunnies and things to grow your food like, mainstream large ag does. Which is a thing that people often say, vegetarians, you're still murdering animals, etc.
Right. That's the common thing. Well, I mean,
Aaron, go ahead.
Even like the idea that rabbits and squirrels die from monocropping and stuff, even that to me is still karmically much better than killing animals, because when you kill an animal to eat it, you have the full intention of purposefully murdering the animal to eat it. And so the karmic impact is much greater, not just in your body, but on humanity at large. Intentional murder, right? The squirrels and rabbits that die would be obviously an unfortunate consequence, but no one's trying to kill them. It's an accident, right? So there's a lot less karma to those deaths, but nonetheless, a big part of the Asene, the Jesus diet in the Asene gospel is that Jesus says, don't eat food that comes from faraway lands. Eat locally grown food. Eat food that's in your own environment. And so I get all my food from local farms who don't use huge monocrops and big ag, so they don't murder animals and innocent creatures to grow their crops. And so like the number one argument about, well, eating plants is still killing something, right? Because we know plants have sentience, but that's just not true, right? I don't go around pulling flowers out of the ground and chomping on them. I don't eat plants. I eat what plants produce. The cucumbers, the tomatoes, the peas, the peppers. These are the things that plants produce because they want them to be eaten, because that's how they scatter their seeds. Same with fruit. I don't eat trees. I eat what trees produce, which is fruit. They want me to eat their fruit, right? Likewise, I don't eat animals. I eat what animals produce, the milk and the eggs. So it's a murder-free, karmic-free diet. And that's the number one essential is get the murder, get the karma out of your diet. And that's the most important aspect of any diet. And from there, you can refine it based on your own nutritional needs and whatnot. Everyone has to eat their own unique diet and find what works for them, right? But we should all agree that having murder be a part of our diet is something we should, as a human species, try to begin moving away from.
And the inorganic elements that the plants make available by chelation, of different elements so that they are usable or bioavailable to the human body, are the reason why plants are so important. And that's their job. And being a farmer myself, if you are tending to crops, you come to the conclusion very quickly that they react to your consciousness. So there's a different symbiotic relationship. And so when you are, eating locally, or especially if you're growing your own, you're getting your own energy back. And it's just a whole different relationship, as you say, versus taking life. Okay, so I think we probably also got that one covered. Go ahead, Mike.
Essenes have the different angels, right? Which are the elements, which directly tie into the creation of plant life. Versus an animal, which is completely different in terms of its generation and its in evolvement and creation on the planet, on here where we are.
Yeah,
I almost said planet. I get in trouble now if I say planet, Aaron.
Oh boy.
So that's what's so cool. Once again, when you get into the Essenes teachings, and once again, why I love Zechli and how he relates it to the 12 or the 16 forces that go back to Zoroastrianism. Is that this is all like, and it ties in, they're alchemists. Mm-hmm. They were alchemists. They understood the natural forces. They understood how the realm works. And by applying that science, this is a science. They then can have the moral framework to know what's the best nutrition, the best way to move forward. So, and it proved out, as Bear and I say, we're all about function. Right. And obviously they were functioning at a pretty high level if they're living that long and thriving in the desert.
Well, even more than that, their ability to be farmers and gardeners was remarkable to Josephus and Philo, who write about how they literally, it's funny to read because they're like astounded at how these people in this burning wasteland desert had these abundant fields and flowers and crops and gardens and everything, that they had somehow learned how to grow food even in the midst of a harsh climate because they were super tapped into natural law. They probably used copper and things like that, and biodynamic farming and regenerating the soil. And they understood how to get life to grow even in a harsh environment. And that's a testament, again, to the science that they had understood. And what's interesting about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that when they discovered them, they were trying to find out, what did these people write these parchments on? Because clearly it couldn't have been like animal skins, because there's no way they would have had cows in that kind of environment. And to their surprise, when they tested the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found that they were written on cow hides. And they were like, how? This is impossible. They must have had cows come from far away. And just the way that like Western scientific thinkers always underestimate ancient cultures is hilarious to me. Because it can't possibly be that they were more intelligent than us. So obviously they were bringing cows in from hundreds of miles away to write Dead Sea Scrolls on them. No, they were their cows that they raised and drank their milk and all of that because they knew how to raise animals in a harsh environment. They probably had grasslands for them to graze on and a normal environment for a cow. And we just can't conceive of how that's possible because we don't understand natural law. We don't even understand that all of like climate change is being caused by us destroying the soil. 2/3 of the soil on our planet's been destroyed with monocropping. And so it can't pull the carbon out of the atmosphere anymore. Like, we don't even understand that. We're blaming cows farting on climate change. So like, of course they know more than we do.
It's pretty funny. So, Aaron, was an authentic saying of Jesus, I'm paraphrasing, the last enemy to overcome is death, or something like that? Was that, in fact, something that he said? And
I'm
if so,
very
what
certain
did
it
he
was.
mean by
Yeah.
that? Kind of riffing off, eating death, but taking it further beyond just dietary. What was he telling us with that?
Okay, I think that comes from First Corinthians.
Mm-hmm.
So that wouldn't have been a saying of Jesus. But there's a whole lot of sayings of Jesus on this topic in the Asene gospel. And I think we kind of touched on it in our earlier conversation on like the karma of eating the body of death. I think like you brought up the angels, Mike, the 14 angels, and this was the main spiritual path of the Essenes, if we had to lay one out, is that they would commune with an angel in the morning of the earthly mother, one of the seven angels, and then an angel of the heavenly Father in the evening. And in the Asene Gospel of Peace, and this, I believe it's the second gospel, Mike, when you brought up the Dead Sea Scrolls being discovered after Edmund Bordeaux had published the Asene Gospel of Peace, so he had published these fragments that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls before the Dead Sea Scrolls. So like, how did he forge that if it's a forgery, right? He, as the revised edition, he put in a chapter called Fragments Identical with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I believe it's 3 different texts. It's the Manual of Disciplines, the Book of Hymns, and a third one I can't remember, that he translated in the second Asene Gospel and were found at Qumran. And so one of the things that Josephus writes is that, I believe it was Josephus, could have been Philo, that the Essenes had a strict communion practice, a daily meditation practice, morning and evening. And that was written in the 1st century. And so we don't know until Edmund published the Asene Gospel, we don't know what that practice was. But when we get the Asene Gospel of Peace, Edmund Bordeaux translated what their actual practice was, which was these daily communions with these angels. And the idea was, if we've been eating the body of death, we've been moving closer to death. So we have to back engineer that back towards life. And what is life? It is the earth itself, right? It's the powers and the energy of earth itself, which begins with those 4 elements. And so Jesus teaches how to commune with the angels, and he gives like a mantra that you repeat each morning when you commune with that daily angel. So like this morning was the angel of water. And so the mantra is, angel of water, enter my blood and give the water of life to my whole body. And you repeat that, and you repeat it with a feeling behind it, right? And then Jesus teaches you to imagine all the manifestations of water on the earth, how water flows through our blood, it flows through the rivers, it undulates in the ocean, it comes from the sky through rain. And as you contemplate the power of water and that power in yourself, you develop a spiritual bond with that element. You literally like forge a path, a bridge between you and the element itself, and you move into more of a oneness with that element. And so I believe that this was the way Jesus did his miracles. And in fact, all the Essenes that performed miraculous healing abilities in the 1st century probably were using these principles that they had for, I think it's the initiation path was 7 years of communing with the angels before you could be an official, like Asene initiate or part of the white brotherhood where you'd wear the white headband. You had to do 7 years of daily communion with the angels. And so you can imagine the spiritual potency you would build up from these daily communions, morning and evening, where you're integrating these powers, both earthly and cosmic powers, into your very being, so that you can actually take command over these powers, over them, in cooperation with them. But for like performing physical healing, you could lay hands on someone, and because my body has a relationship, let's say, with the angel of air, water, sunlight, and earth, I can lay my hands on someone and telepathically command the angels in their body to perform the healing or get back into alignment in the body in the ways they need to, and to go to work in that person's body. So like I can transmute my alignment with the angels into someone else's body is the idea. And there's a miracle where Jesus heals a blind man by spitting in the dirt. It's a really famous Jesus miracle. And it says he spits in the dirt, rubs it into mud, picks it up and rubs it on the guy's eyes, and then says, now go wash in the pool of Siloam and you'll be able to see. And so the blind man wanders probably 15 minutes down the road to the pool of Siloam, washes the mud off, and he can see. You're like, that's a weird miracle. Why would he do it that way? Well, I think what he was probably doing was using the 4 angels, angel of water in the saliva. He spits it onto the dirt, so it's going through the angel of air. The angel of air is permeating it as soon as it's out of his body. It's hitting the angel of earth in the dirt, and the angel of sunlight is shining down upon it. He makes it into mud, so he's got all 4 angels in the mud, and he probably, psychically commanded or transmuted his energy into that mud as he put it on the guy's eyeballs, and intended for those angels to heal the blindness. The guy goes to wash, and he can see again. It's just a theory, but I think when you study the philosophy of the Essenes and how they believed by communing with these angels, we gain their powers within us. And, Jesus being seen walking on water and things like that also kind of give credence to this theory that a lot of the miraculous powers is what's naturally available to all of us if we can establish a deep metaphysical relationship to these powers and literally understand we are these angels. We literally are the earth that we eat. We are the water, we are the air we breathe, the sunlight we take in, and we have no life at all apart from them. So there isn't really a relationship happening, it's a oneness. But the communion is a way to establish that oneness spiritually.
And how would the Essenes conceive the ascension process? What were their beliefs around that?
So this is really cool. This gets into the tree of life, where they have a little drawing of a man that's in a meditating posture, halfway beneath the earth, halfway above the earth. And he's in the center of a tree. And there's 7 roots going down into the earth, and there's 7 branches going up to the heavens. And each branch and root has a name of one of the angels. And so they believe that, how we talked about getting back into alignment with the law of one. And that's the way we're going to extend the human lifespan and return back to the natural design the creator intended for us to be living, hundreds of years, even 1,000 years, is that we have to embody the tree of life within ourselves. And so they practiced embodying the tree of life through the communions with the angels. And then, of course, the very pure form of living, aesthetic living, living in alignment with those laws as well. By doing that and passing down those gene codes generation by generation, each new generation is more easily able to connect with these spiritual powers than the previous one, and their lifespan is therefore a little bit longer than the previous one. So it was through the tree of life that they saw was the path of ascension, and that, Jesus was probably, again, to them, the first child born who came out of the womb embodying, this tree of life. And they said, at the center of the eternal garden stands the tree of life. And the eternal garden was their metaphor for the universe. They also called it the infinite sea or the infinite ocean. And so to say that at the center of the universe is the tree of life is an interesting statement, because there isn't really a point in the center of the universe, because the universe is infinite. And so they really were alluding to within yourself is the center of the universe. Within yourself is the tree of life, but you've got to awaken that tree of life and commune with it if you want to enjoy the tree of life. And that goes back to the book of Genesis, right? In the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve are told by God, you can eat the tree of life all you want, but do not eat the tree of duality, basically. Knowledge of good and evil, separation consciousness. And because man ate the tree of separation consciousness, we lost the tree of life, which was unity consciousness. And so the Essenes were like, we got to eat from that tree if we're going to get back to that state of consciousness.
Did they believe that they could resurrect as Jesus did in a single embodiment?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure if there's anything on that idea of like physical resurrection. When you look into the Shroud of Turin, I don't know if you guys have looked into that. Have you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So, it's pretty unequivocal proof to me that Jesus did somehow resurrect. I have a theory that it could have been extraterrestrial beings that did that for him, but it also could have been by his own spiritual power for sure as well. So I don't know how or why it happened, but I do know that it almost certainly did happen because they've tried to debunk it for a long time, and everything they try to do to debunk it just proves the authenticity of it. So like maybe they did have a belief in that, and that was how Jesus got that understanding and ability. I think like all mystery schools and esoteric occult traditions, there's levels to what kind of knowledge you get access to. And so they don't just give away all the pearls, so to speak, to the new initiates, but you've got to earn your stripes and earn your way through the path. And so I think Jesus, especially like the 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, was undoubtedly a super hardcore Asene initiation ritual of like, if you wanted to get into, let's say, the Great White Brotherhood and become like an Asene master and a master teacher, you would have to do this 40 days in the wilderness kind of initiation, because there's no way you're going to live for 40 days in the wilderness if you don't have a relationship with those angels and you can't take in the sunlight and the air and get your sustenance from that. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things to speculate on there.
There's also those so-called lost years of Jesus where he was studying with other masters elsewhere in the Himalayas and so forth.
Very true.
What do you know about that? Mm-hmm.
Well, have you guys read the text called The Hidden Life of Issa by Nicholas Notovich?
No.
Oh boy.
I'm familiar with it. I think I saw a Gaia special on it. Is this about where the tradition of him going back east and well, you lay it down for us.
Yeah. Nicholas Notovich was a Russian. I don't know exactly what his trade was. I'm blanking now. He was a researcher of some kind, and he was traveling the world doing different researches on religious topics. And he went to a Buddhist monastery and was in a conversation with a Buddhist monk who they got into this topic of Issa. And Issa is the Aramaic name for Yeshua. And the monk basically says, like, we have a scroll that describes the hidden years, the missing years of Issa's lifetime. He came here to Tibet. He went to Syria. He went to India, spent some time in Egypt. And Nicholas Notovich was like, oh boy, do you guys have that text here? And he says, no, we don't have it here. It's kept at another monastery in a town called, starts with an L. I can't remember. It's in the book when you read the book. So he goes to that town, talks to one of the head monks, and he's trying not to like make too big of a deal about it and like alert people. So he's just like getting to know them. He stays for a few days and he's talking to the head lama, and he mentions he asks him about the text of the missing years of Issa. And he says, yeah, we have that here somewhere, but we have like 80,000 scrolls here in our library because the Buddhists are very big on keeping documented history of every enlightened being that lives in their tradition and keeping those records for all of time. And there's been a whole lot of enlightened beings in the Buddhist tradition. So they were like, basically the Lama says, we have it, but it would take us weeks of digging to find it. So like, come back another time, we'll get it for you. And he's like, dang it, man, I was so close. So he gives up, he heads back home, and he's on his horse with two servants, and his horse steps into a ditch or something, falls over and crushes his leg, and he breaks his leg underneath his horse. And he's only like less than half a day's journey from the monastery. And he's like, well, my best bet is to go back there for sure. So he and his servants turn around, they go back, and he's in like extreme agony, obviously. And so the Buddhist monks come out, and the servants run in saying, hey, like Mr. Notovich fell, his leg's broken, we need people to attend to him. And the Buddhist monks come running out, super compassionate, take him off the horse, carry him inside, give him a nice room with a nice bed. They put a splint on his leg, and the head lama hears about it and comes in to see him. And he takes great pity on Nicholas because of the extreme suffering he was in. Breaking your femur is like the 10 out of 10 on the pain threshold. It's like the most painful experience you can have. So he was probably in a great deal of suffering. And the head lama is like, this poor guy, like, how can I cheer this guy up? And so he tells his Buddhist monks to go find the scroll of Issa. And he brings it to him and says, I think like the third day there, he's like, hey, like I brought you something. And he's like, what is this? And he's like, this is the hidden life of Issa. And he's like, oh my gosh, can someone read it to me? And he's like, of course. So he has a monk read him the text, and it's not very long. It's probably like 30 pages or something. And he says, hey, could I translate this to English while you're reading it? Because he was translating it from like Tibetan to English. And they were like, of course, yeah, this belongs to the world. You can totally translate it. So he's writing down word for word as the Buddhist monk is reading it. And so that's how we have the English translation. And it's again, a super remarkable read because it has a very ancient kind of tone to it. And it very much parallels the Jesus we see in the Gospels, that, you know, Jesus is always waving his finger at the Pharisees, calling out the hypocrisy, calling them out for their double standards. And then they want to kill him and he has to escape all the time. And everywhere Jesus went, apparently this was the repeating pattern, is that he would amass a huge following of people. He would teach the way of righteousness, the way of God. And then he would call out the hypocrisy of the priesthood in that area. And the priesthood would try to kill him and he would have to escape. So when he's in Syria, he calls out the Zoroastrian priests for teaching sun worship and says essentially like, hey, you guys are teaching that God is separate in God's creation. But who do you think makes the sun move and the stars move? Like, it's the creator. It's not, the sun isn't a God to itself. There's only one God. So stop teaching people to worship the sun. And they try to kill him and he leaves. He goes to India and he calls out the Brahmin priest class saying, you guys are teaching people to worship idols and you're making these, I mean, they would make millions of idols and they would make the lower caste of people create the idols, which was like a slave job. And so Jesus says, you guys are castigating these actual human beings who are God's children to work like slaves to make your idols. And then you're telling people to worship these idols that God's not in while you're harming the people God is living in. You guys are hypocrites. And they try to kill him. His disciples let him know and he escapes. He goes to another place. Same thing happens. So to me, it's like, that makes sense that that's probably how Jesus would have rocked anywhere he went, is like, he's going to be the same guy wherever he goes. And eventually he goes back to Palestine, of course, does the same thing, calls them out, and is eventually crucified for it. But yeah, it's, if anyone's interested in learning more about Jesus's missing years, like that's the text you want to read. And you'll find it to be, I think, not only very compelling, but very inspiring.
Wonderful. There's another great series of books that allegedly document a British expedition in the early 1900s, late 1800s, that was sent out because there's constant reports that the government was interested in of remarkable men living in these remote areas of the Himalayas and the eastern hemisphere of the world. And so they went out thinking it was going to be a few months expedition. They actually spent 25 years out there. And there's 5 books that are called The Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. And
oh yeah, I have those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
right here,
this expedition party actually comes into these remote locations, and they are walking and talking with the masters, including Jesus. And anyway, it's a lot of great wisdom in the books, whether it's absolutely authentic or not. It's definitely fascinating, very inspiring for sure. And you know, in my own studies years and years ago with people that were from the old country, you know, very old at that time when I was in my 20s and 30s. And, you know, they're from these monasteries in the hills and remote areas of China. And I was with them learning martial arts techniques and things from the old school. They talked constantly about these places that they termed the Valley of the Ancients, where the adepts had learned how to preserve their lifespan by hundreds of years. And the whole reason for them doing that was to have an uninterrupted flow of consciousness, you know, without going through interruptions with embodiments and coming back with amnesia. And through that process, that was the way that they actually achieved a physical ascension eventually. And anyway,
amazing.
Yeah, seems to be a lot of reports of that actually, you know, being a process that's attainable for anybody. And that's why I brought up that one quote, the last enemy to overcome. And the my favorite quote of Jesus of all time was, again paraphrasing, "Greater works ye shall do." And I always pondered on that. Well, what was he telling us?
Yeah. I think he knew that even he had only tapped into a fraction of what's available metaphysically. And we see him as like, oh, he's this unreachable standard. And he was like, guys, y'all are going to way surpass me. You know, he's trying to flip the script a little bit.
And I'm sure he hasn't stood still since, as far as his development.
Right. I mean, no being in the universe is not evolving still, right? We're all on the same path of evolution. What's interesting about that, Bear, is if you read the Law of One, in the Law of One, they question the entities named Ra, and it's essentially the extraterrestrial civilization that visited Egypt some 12,000 years ago. And the Egyptians named them Ra after the sun god. And so they were like, sure, whatever you want to call us, you can call us Ra. So they identify themselves as Ra, but that's not their actual name. But as they're questioning Ra, they said, you know, why'd you come to Egypt back then? And they said, well, we took great pity on the Egyptian people because the average lifespan was only about 30 years. And they said, we saw this civilization of people that were stuck in this perpetual spiritual childhood. Because you're very right, having a new embodiment requires you to go back through the veil of forgetting, form a whole new physical identity, and start from scratch. So it really does interrupt the ascension process to a large degree, and it slows down the process. And so they said, we wanted to help teach them how to extend the human lifespan so they could get some amount of evolution out of their life versus just being reincarnated back into another body every 30 years. It's basically stagnation. And I went to a Egypt museum in Denver when I lived in Denver years ago. And I remember touring through the different archives they had, and there was different hieroglyph, fragments they showed, and there was different mummies that they showed, and they would have these little placards you could read about. And there was one mummy that was dated to be like 4,000 years or 5,000 years old. And the placard said that in Egyptian times, the average lifespan was about 30 years. And I was like, whoa, that's what the Law of One says. So this is like documented that the Egyptians, for whatever reason, were not living very long, but because they were a very panentheistic culture, that they believed the divine was in everything and all of nature, the Ra civilization saw it not as an infringement of their free will to walk among them, because like they'll never go to a monolithic culture like a Judaism or Islam or Christianity, because they don't believe God is in creation. They think that's demonic and witchcraft to say that God's in the tree and stuff. So they can't go visit those kind of cultures that are monolithic, but pantheistic cultures are wide open. So they visited Egypt to teach them how to extend the human lifespan. And they did that through building the pyramids to teach them how to use crystals and sacred geometry shapes to reestablish coherence and energetic harmony in the body. So yeah, I think that's a principle across all spiritual traditions like Buddhism and Ayurveda and in Hinduism as well are big on not eating meat, because vegetarianism extends the human lifespan. And the longer you get to live, the more spiritual progress you get to make. And that should be the most important, criteria for a human lifetime.
Yeah. So maybe a great final question is, did the Essenes and Jesus actually teach reincarnation?
I think the Essenes for sure believed in reincarnation. There's an interesting passage in the New Testament where there's two different passages where this is mentioned like this, but Jesus asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? And he says, some people say that you are Elijah. Other people say that you're Moses. Other people say you're one of the prophets. And then Jesus says, who do you say I am? And he says, oh, you're the Son of God. And so I find that passage to be very revealing about what first century Jews actually believed, because I don't think this would have been unique to the Essenes. I think even Jews believed in some kind of reincarnation. It's very clear that Orthodox Jews in those days were annihilationists as it pertains to evildoers. This is all through the Old Testament. There's not a single mention of hell in the Old Testament or anything about a place of torment that bad people go. It's unequivocal in the Old Testament. They call it Sheol, which means the grave. And they say the wicked go down to Sheol. Their souls are blotted out. They shall be remembered no more. They're annihilated, basically. So their belief was that those who don't follow the ways of Yahweh are snuffed out of existence. Those who do get to live with Yahweh in heaven and go to heaven. And probably that you get the chance to reincarnate again, because they all believed Elijah was going to come back and return. They believed that Moses would return. And it's like, what do you mean return? What else could that possibly mean other than reincarnate? And so basically his disciples are like, some say you're the reincarnation of Elijah. Some say you're the reincarnation of Moses. Other people say you're a reincarnation of another prophet. And then Jesus says, well, who do you think that I am? You're the Son of God. Correct. Flesh and blood, the hearsay of men, didn't tell you this, but the Holy Spirit revealed this to you from within. And so I think Jesus in that teaching was trying to draw this parallel that, yes, although we reincarnate, the physical persona, the body, is not who we are. What I am is the Christ itself, the spiritual being. And that's what I really am. And that's why reincarnation probably wouldn't have been high on Jesus's list to teach, because it's very secondary to the important message, which is like, forget the body. The body is just a vehicle. What matters is that you're an eternal spirit. And Jesus definitely taught the teaching of eternal life in the New Testament over and over again.
And perhaps the most misinterpreted statements of Jesus was I am, and that he was most probably not referring to his physical personage, but just his individualization, as we all are from the same source.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's unequivocal he wasn't, because he said, if you want to be my disciple, die to yourself. And he wasn't obviously referring to physically kill yourself, because then you can't be his disciple. So he's referring to another self that you need to die to. And I think all of us would agree that has to be the egoic self, the false self, the mentally created self you think you are. He says, die to that self before you can even think of following me. And so that means Jesus was never, ever speaking from an egoic position. I, the human person named Jesus, am the way. Confess me, praise me, worship me. No, he told people not to confess him and worship him. When people tried to worship him, he said, don't worship me. Only God is good. When he did miracles, he said, don't tell anyone about this. God does everything, you know? So he was very much trying to show people it's not about the person you think you are. No person is the way exclusively. There's one way, which is I am. And God revealed that way to Moses at the burning bush. I am that I am. That God is the first person in the present tense, right? And that's why Jesus said, hey, if you guys don't see me in the poor people, you don't see me at all. You don't know who I am if you think I'm not in the widow and the orphan. You know, that's the I am state, if anything is.
Brilliant.
Perfect ending there. Hey, this has been a phenomenal chat, Aaron. Appreciate you coming on with us. Any final remarks or statements, or please let our audience know how they can find you, what you're up to right now, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, no, just thanks for having me. I love having these conversations with other people that are interested in these topics, especially the Essenes. They're still kind of a lesser known pathway right now, but they're making a huge resurgence in the spiritual community. So I'm grateful to be a part of that resurgence with you guys. So thank you for having me. You can find me at Aaron Abke, basically anywhere, aaronabke.com, Instagram, youtube.com/Aaron Abke. And I do have a lot of videos and more by the day on the Essenes and different podcasts I've done. So if you want to go deeper into that, you can find some good videos on my YouTube channel.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Aaron. This was wonderful. And I'm going to get through your reading list there, and hopefully maybe someday we can do a part 2, and I can be a little bit more read up on some of the things that you're talking about. So I look forward to that. And thanks again. This was wonderful.
My pleasure, man. Thank you again.
I'm going to drop the reading list people have asked in the chat of the books we've mentioned on this cast. I'm going to put it in the show notes below so you guys can check it out. Zekli, I think he's written like 40, 50 books or something. Highly recommend getting into the Gospel of Peace, though. It's just such a wonderful read. And, you know, it's an easy read, too. It's reading poetry, basically.
Beautiful read.
Yeah, yeah, it's awesome. And, you know, and the words of the wise Popeye, I am what I am, eat your spinach. And remember to get outside, get your feet in the dirt, go plant something, go for a hike. Mother Nature's our great teacher. Show her some love. And we'll see you again next Thursday. I think actually we're on a special time next Thursday because I think we have an Australian guest. So we'll make sure to let you guys know that. Rachel Vaughn's coming on to talk about the ley lines and the work they're doing. And she's
that's going to be a great one.
Yeah, so that'll be a fun one. And
Nice.
thanks
I'll
again.
get out my biogeometry technology so we can do ley lines together.
Let's go.
Awesome. Well, hey, Aaron, it was really fun hanging with you at Confluence, and hopefully,
man.
you know, if you ever want to come out this way and come to the farm, we live in essentially an Asene lifestyle.
Nice.
Yeah, basically.
I'm envious, bro.
And yeah, like the 4 elements is what I try to engage with every day. Someone was asking, you know, what are the biohacks for longevity? There's no biohack. There's no need to hack anything. I mean, it can help because we're living in a toxic, especially if you're living in a city or something, but get out, get the sun, get the light in your eyes from the sun, go get your body on the earth, get your hands in the earth, go in the water, surround yourself in the waters of life, and get the breath of God in your body through fresh air.
Let's go. Natural law is the hack, baby.
Yep, it is. Okay, guys, thanks so much.
Peace and love.
Peace out.